All right, let's get started here today. Welcome everyone. My name is Abby Lambert. I am a food preservation intern with SDSU Extension. And we are so excited you guys have joined us again for another session of our food preservation at home series. So this is our fourth session and it runs all the way through September 22nd. During this time, we'll be sharing a lot of information about different food preservation methods at home. And so we're happy you guys decided to join us today. Of course, like I said, we'll be covering a variety of different topics. So coming up, you can see what topics we have left on this screen. We did cover some more like pressure canning as well as water bath canning. So if you're new to our group, you can go back and watch those videos on our YouTube page, SDSU Extension YouTube page. And so of course we have jams and jellies coming up next week, then pickling, and we'll close out our sessions with freezing, dehydrating, and then canning meats. So some of you had questions that you submitted when you registered, and so we'll try to get those answered throughout this session. But if you have any questions that come up throughout this session, feel free to type those in the chat box and we'll get those answered either during the session or during our question portion of the session. So before I introduce Brianna, who will be speaking with us today, I would like you to type in the chat box just some information about you so we can get to know you, like your location and then your favorite fermented product, whether that is you like to ferment it or you like to eat the fermented product. So we'll have you type that in the chat box. But before I introduce Brianna, I am also going to put up some polling questions as well, just so we can gauge a little bit where your knowledge is regarding the topic we're doing today. Let's see. So our first one is your knowledge on current practices of fermenting. Give you a little bit more time to get those votes in. All right. So we've got a lot of not super confident today for this first question, which is totally fine. We're hoping to bring that up by the end. Our second question, your ability to follow safe practices for fermenting food products. Give you a few more seconds to get that vote in. All right. So this one's a little bit better. We've got some more that are feeling a little more confident. So again, we'll hope to raise that by the end. And finally, our last question here. Oh, last question here. Knowing where to go for safe research-tested recipes. Okay, so we got some more confident people on this one as well. Very good. Very good to see. Okay, well, with that, I'm going to introduce Brianna Ralph, and she is the assistant professor and a food and nutrition specialist from Montana State University Extension. Brianna is a registered dietitian nutritionist and has been expanding her knowledge of fermentation in cooking and in the body for the past 2.5 years in her work with Montana's Master Food Preserver Training. And so she also enjoys making fermented cabbage and drinking some local kombucha, but her family especially enjoys trying new recipes made with her sourdough starter. So welcome, Brianna. We'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. I'm going to pull up my screen here and we'll share some information with you. I'm very excited to get to be here today, and I see some familiar faces as well as some new faces, so that is fantastic. And I believe that you are seeing my screen right now, but if not, let me know. And I think, there we go. So what I'm here to talk to you about today is fermentation. And it's a really fantastic process that has been around for a really long time. So what we're going to talk about today with regards to fermentation is what foods are fermented. So when we talk about fermented foods, what exactly are we talking about? And then what is fermentation? So we'll talk a little bit about the science and the safety. And then we're going to go through a process of fermenting one food. I saw a number of you had mentioned here that sauerkraut was something that you're familiar with being fermented, and maybe like to sample some as well. And so that is going to be what we're going to talk about, a process of today. And so I did want to just also mention, if there are questions or comments, feel free to put them in the chat. I did see the questions that were shared in advance, and so I will try to answer those as we're going throughout too, but just let me know if other things come up too. So in getting started here, what is fermented foods? And so when we think about fermented foods, what foods are we talking about? And so you've listed a couple of your favorites, and I'd like you to go back to that chat box and see if you can type any more foods that you can think of that might also be fermented foods. I'm going to give you a minute to stretch your brain, see if you can think of anything. Even if you're not sure if it's fermented, go ahead and put it in the chat box. We'll talk about what those fermented foods might be. And from our fermented foods, favorite fermented foods, I see some pickles and some sauerkraut. Some yogurt was also mentioned. Kombucha was one of the things that I had mentioned as well. Pickled fish, ooh, very nice. Yeah, so all of those, sourdough bread, yep, sourdough is a fermented food. Dilly beans, that is great. So we have a variety of different foods, and when we think about what are those fermented foods, it's actually a really long list of what foods are considered fermented. And we're going to talk about, there's some nuances and some variation in terms of when we say fermented foods, there's different kinds of fermentation that can occur. But fermentation is something that's been around for, it's one of the oldest forms of food preservation that we have in the world. And almost every culture has their own fermented foods that they really like. And incorporate on a regular basis into their diets. And some of those I have listed here, but this is, again, not even an exhaustive list. On the left-hand side, you see a lot of fermented things like vegetables. So we see kimchi and sauerkraut, which have a lot of similarities, both that cabbage base. You can also have the lacto-fermented pickles. And we'll talk a little bit more about pickles because there is some variation between different types of pickles that you might have. Quick pickles, if you've ever heard or tried those, are not necessarily a fermented food, but a lot of other pickles called the lacto-fermented pickles would be considered fermented foods. And pickles are not just cucumbers. We like to get exciting with a lot of variety in terms of the different vegetables that you can ferment. You'll also see escabeche, which again is a spicy vegetable fermentation. Tempeh or miso, thinking about soy fermentation. You can really ferment any kinds of fruits and vegetables. Some cultures have fermented lemons, which is an interesting product that a lot of people around the world will eat as well. And then we get into some of the beverages that are fermented. And I just have a couple of those here. Kombucha is one that you might have heard of that is a fermentation of tea. We also have beer and wine. Those are often household fermentations that you have maybe sitting in your cupboard as well, or your refrigerator, depending on how you drink them. And then we also have sourdough or injera, which are bread formations that are made from fermentation. And then we get into some different dairy products that are fermented. We eat a lot of dairy products that you may not have always associated with being fermented, but most yogurts are fermented, and a lot of cheeses go through a different fermentation process. Kefir and lassi are also fermented dairy products. Again, those are more of the beverage variety. And then a lot of the sauces that you might use in terms of seasoning are different fermented products, thinking about soy sauce, fish sauce, Worcestershire, as well as many more sauces are actually formed by fermentation. Another interesting one I always like to throw in there is not all, but many of the chocolate or coffee varieties that you might get have also gone through a different fermentation process. So when we're thinking about fermentation, I'd like you to take a moment to write into the chat box, why do we ferment foods? What are the reasons that you might ferment foods? And maybe this list will give you some ideas in terms of why you might ferment foods. But I, again, want you to brainstorm, stretch, why might we ferment a food to preserve them is one really great answer and very much in line with what we're talking about in this series. So it's extending that shelf life, that long-term storage, exactly. I also see flavor coming up here, and that is a really great reason to ferment things. So we think about that taste, and different types of fermentations, different lengths of fermentations can give you really different and unique tastes. So my sauerkraut might not taste the same as your sauerkraut, even if we use the same recipe. And in a lot of maybe baking varieties, or even in a lot of different food preservation processes, we want to get the same product at the end. So we're trying to get consistency, but fermentation is a little bit different, and you can have it achieve the taste that is most preferable to you in that recipe. And so there is some more potential for experimentation and achieving that taste that you might want too. I also see health reasons, and that's another great reason. That nutritional value is definitely some of the reason that people will eat fermented foods. And so we'll talk about what some of those potential health and nutrition related components of fermentation might be too. The other aspect, some of these other aspects related to kind of that quality of food, along with taste, fermentation can also get you different aromas. So the smell, a lot of times people will say it's got kind of a vinegary taste or smell. So you definitely get a sour product from fermentations, and along with that can come some smell as well. That again, we want it to smell nice, not necessarily something that smells rancid, because rancid is still not our end goal for what we're looking for in fermentation. We're not trying to spoil things, we're trying to save them from being spoiled. But another component of that quality is also texture. So it can change the texture of the foods that you might be fermenting as well. And again, this is one of the oldest forms of food preservation. And really the goal of fermentation is to try to keep that food from spoiling or going bad by getting a lower pH. So we want a pH below 4.0 in the fermentation process. And so I did want to mention, again, pickles were something that was brought up here. And so pickling and fermentation are not necessarily the same thing. A cucumber that has been pickled usually has vinegar included with it if it's that quick pickle. But fermentation actually occurs without the vinegar and just using a salt brine. So there is difference in the recipe. A lot of times you get a really similar, you can get some similarities between those quick pickles or the lacto fermented pickles. But there's a little different science that's happening in that process. Both are trying to get the pH down in order to make that acidic product at the end though. So now we're going to jump into a little bit of what is that science and food safety behind fermentation. And so the first thing that I want to start out with was that health reason. And what are those health reasons that people might be considering fermented foods? So some of these you might have heard of. If you haven't heard of these before, that's okay too. I'll give you a little bit of a definition of what we're talking about. So some of the things and some of the reasons that people eat fermented foods are because of what we call the microbiome in your gut. And that's all of the little bacteria, the good things that live inside of your stomach and your gut and your intestines that help you to digest your food, help you to be able to use some of the resources that come from our foods, like those great vitamins and minerals. And so we want to keep that microbiome, that living inside our gut, we want to keep it happy and healthy. And one of the ways that we can do that is to feed it. And so feeding ourselves also helps to feed our microbiome in our gut. And we do that in some different ways. One is prebiotics. And prebiotics, something that everybody eats as long as you're eating your fruits and vegetables and your whole grains. These are dietary fibers that come into our body, and they are actually, we're learning a little bit in science that these are things that feed our gut bacteria. So they're not necessarily, they're undigestible plant fibers that feed what we call probiotics, and I'll talk about those in a minute here. But so anytime you're eating fruits, vegetables, whole grains and things, you're getting different dietary fibers, and you need to have a variety of those dietary fibers, which is also why we eat a variety of fruits and vegetables and things in our diets too. But so that's not necessarily specific to fermented foods. But since we are fermenting a lot of things like fruits and vegetables, for example, we're also getting prebiotics when we're eating fermented foods. The other aspect that's a little more unique to fermented foods is probiotics. Similar name, very different in what exactly they are. Probiotics are living things, and again, they are, some of them we already have in our microbiome, but we want a lot of diversity so that they can, because each of these different living things, generally we call them bacteria. Not all bacteria are bad. These are actually good bacteria that are living inside of our body, but they also live in the world around us. And so we want to have a variety of them because they have a variety of different jobs. And so when we take in more of these, we give our body more ability to do some of those different jobs. So when we're thinking about probiotics, that is, again, those beneficial bacteria that help to keep our gut healthy and improve our digestion. They help you to digest different foods and eliminate foods, and they also can crowd out some of those unhealthy bacteria that might also be trying to live in your gut too. And some studies have even shown that these probiotics might be helpful in different gut-related issues, things like IBS or constipation, even things like eczema. The study of what probiotics can do for you is really kind of an expanding field. So I can't say definitively, yes, they do this or they don't do that. But we do know, as with most things, it's a lot, your body appreciates it more when you can eat these in their whole and natural form, as opposed to maybe taking a pill that has probiotics in it. And so when we think about that, one of the ways that we can get probiotics is through eating fermented foods. Because, as we're going to talk a little bit more about, the fermenting process is to actually grow a lot of these bacteria and give them the foods that they want to thrive and survive, so that we can also then eat them, and then they will grow in our stomach as well. So it's a little bit strange to think about that you're trying to make a food so that you can eat some more little living things, but I promise it's entirely, it's not like eating a live bug or anything like that. Fermentation is, again, a really tasty way to eat some of these really healthy products as well. And so the other component that we want to think about is the processing. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes, but one of the questions or concerns I hear a lot when thinking about fermented foods is, well, if I buy a fermented food from the store, like buying my yogurt from the store, are those good probiotics still living in that yogurt that I bought from the store? Well, a lot of things that you buy from the store are going to go through a pasteurization process or a heating process. And a lot of times that process, it kills a lot of those undesirable, maybe germs and bacteria that could cause harm to your body, which is why a lot of our particular dairy products and eggs and things go through that process. We're also doing the same thing when we're canning. of heating up that food to the point that it then eliminates a lot of those harmful germs, but also potentially some of the good ones. But you will find a lot of times in store-bought goods that they're also adding back in a lot of those bacteria after the process, the good bacteria. So a lot of times you can also get fermented foods that have those probiotics added back in, even if you're getting them from the store. Your home-bought products, again, most of those, depending on the way that you preserve them for the long term, may or may not have those probiotics still living in them. So now we're going to think a little bit about the science. I'm not going to go too in depth into what's happening, but it's good to know the different components that are needed to make fermentation happen. Because again, as I mentioned, fermentation is not necessarily as exact of a science as the canning process, for example. We still do want to follow those evidence-based recipes, but the end product, you have a little bit more variation in terms of your own preference for taste and what that end actually is. You get to decide when the end of that fermentation is potentially. So when we're thinking about fermentation, you need three key things. First, you need that thing that grows, that probiotic, and a lot of times that's either a yeast that you might have, a yeast that is growing, a mold that's growing. Again, not all molds are bad, not all bacteria are bad, because bacteria is another component that you might have. Some fermentations, you're actively adding that. So if you think about things like kombucha or sourdough, you have a starter that's already growing and you add that to a product in order for it to encourage that fermentation process. Sometimes, as is the case with something like sauerkraut, some of these bacteria and things are already living on the plants that we're going to use in the fermentation process. So you don't have to add anything. It's already there. You just want to leave it there so that it can do its job moving forward. And then you need an organic substance. Basically, that's just a food or a liquid that has some sort of sugars in it. Not necessarily your table sugar that you might use. It might have different types of sugar, but as long as that yeast or mold or bacteria has some sort of the sugar that it likes, again, a recipe is going to help you to determine if that food has the sugar that bacteria might like, for example. But that is the food that's feeding then that probiotic. But also, and maybe most importantly, you need an anaerobic environment. And so thinking way back to science class, probably in high school or maybe college, anaerobic means that there is no air present. So it's really important to ensure that you don't have air coming in, because these mold and yeast and bacteria like to grow without that air present. And if there is air present, then some other things can grow that we don't want in our fermentation process and can cause the fermentation to go bad, if you will, or cause some of that spoiling that we're trying to avoid to actually happen. But when these three things are together, you get the production of lactic acid or ethanol. And again, that's what makes either the alcohol or that acidic quality happen in your fermented foods. And so that's really our end goal. And a lot of times throughout the fermentation process, basically it's an eating process. It's an eating process where the bacteria eats the sugar, and then this acid is really the end product of that. And it can continue for a long time until all that sugar is eaten up. But we also know that a lot of these molds and bacteria and yeast can continue on for a long time after that process too. So what are some of the key things that we also want to be thinking about when we're thinking about starting a fermentation? So we know that freshness matters. A lot of times you've probably heard this when talking about other types of food preservation. You don't necessarily want to use the bad apples at the bottom of the barrel. You don't want to wait until they're overly ripe and starting to rot a bit before you think about what you want to do to preserve them. You want to use them at their peak freshness. And it's not about the looks necessarily of the fruit or vegetable, perhaps, that you're thinking about fermenting. The freshness of a fruit or vegetable, for example, also really determines the water content of that fruit or vegetable and the sugar content. And again, as we talked about, the sugar is really an important component that is being consumed. And so we want to have the right amount in there for the fermentation process to occur. But we'll also talk about how water, especially when thinking about vegetable or dry fermentation, can be a really important component in terms of ensuring that anaerobic environment, so that environment without oxygen. And so freshness is a really important thing to consider. Those fresh fruits and vegetables that you pick from your garden this year are really great potential candidates for fermentation right after you pick them as well. So another component that we want to think about is salt. So all fermentations have some sort of salt in them. Different quantities are used depending on what type of fermentation you're doing, and we're really trying to achieve a certain percentage of salt concentration. That's why also it's really important to ensure that you have the recipe, the research tested recipes, because just guessing on your amount of salt, it's not like you're salting maybe a steak, for example, where it's to taste. The salt is actually doing a job in the fermentation, and so we need a specific amount depending on the amount that you might have. And when we think about salt, not all salt is created the same. Again, with other forms of food preservation, we want to think about getting maybe that canning or pickling salt instead of something that is ionized or anti-caking salt. Those ionized and anti-caking salts, good for, again, your table and seasoning foods after they've been cooked, for example, but pickling and canning salts will ensure that the fermentation process can occur in the way that we're hoping as well. So thinking about that quantity is really important, but also the quality of the type of salt that you're using. And so just one note on why we think about that salt concentration again is that if we have too much salt, it can actually soften the vegetables more than we want. For example, it can, so that texture isn't what we want, and produce things that don't necessarily have the flavor that we're looking for. And having too much salt actually can extend that fermentation process beyond what we're estimating as well. So it delays that natural fermentation. And again, it can also create some unpleasant flavors, potentially changing the color, or promote growth of different bacteria or yeasts that we're not hoping will continue to grow as well. So one more component that we want to think about in this fermentation process is the environment. So when we're thinking about the environment that we are fermenting, this means, again, we want to keep it anaerobic. We want to keep the air off the surface of the fermentation. So we'll talk a little bit more about what that top surface might look like in different fermentations that you would be doing. In a canning process, you are screwing on the top of a lid. Obviously thinking about headspace and different things, but here you actually want to think about some different components in what goes on top of the fermentation. But similar to all other food preservation processes, we really want to think about that clean food and clean equipment. That's really important. While we are promoting the growth of different bacteria and yeast, for example, we don't want other things to be introduced because that can cause spoilage. Fermentations can go bad, even though at some levels it seems counterintuitive because we're encouraging things to grow. We don't necessarily want those unhealthy things to still grow as well. So that means making sure that our kitchen is clean, our utensils are clean, our food has been appropriately cleaned and rinsed, and we want to avoid that cross-contamination as well. We'll also talk a little bit about the temperature and the amount of time that goes into the fermentation process, and how to keep food safe after the fermentation process too. Because after things are fermented, fermented foods, again, are preserved so they can last for longer than maybe a cabbage that you just put in your refrigerator might last. A fermented cabbage is going to last longer, but there are certain ways that we can keep that safe and ensure that we don't maybe recontaminate a food product after it has fermented as well. So I just wanted to, again, reiterate some of those food safety principles that we think about, because as with all of the food that we're making in our kitchen, we want to really make sure that we are keeping it safe. So that means clean food, clean utensils, clean kitchen environment, and the utensils maybe that you're putting the food into or chopping it up on. We want to keep things separate. So definitely if you're fermenting things like fruits or vegetables, keep those away from any potential uncooked perishable food items, particularly things like meat products. Don't cut those in the same place that you might be then also chopping up some fermented food, future fermented foods. We're not necessarily cooking our fermentation. You can, I'll talk about that you can can your fermented foods as well as a form of further elongating their life. But for the most part, when we think about cooking here, we're thinking about the time that it takes to ferment. And then also the chill. So the temperature that we're keeping things at is really important throughout the fermentation process to both encourage that fermentation, but also to ensure the safety and that it is reaching that acidic quality that we need to have a safe food as well. So here's a brief descriptor that you can look at as a general rule. Again, different fermentations might take different amounts of time or different temperatures, but as a general rule, a lot of things that you might be fermenting, particularly things like fruits and vegetables, these are a lot of the guidelines that you will see. So you want to keep it in that around room temperature. You don't want it too cold because then the bacteria and the yeast and things will slow down and not start eating those sugars at a rapid enough pace. And so that's actually kind of stopping the fermentation process. But you don't want it too hot as well because then that encourages other things to potentially grow. So right around that room temperature, maybe a root cellar or pantry, a cool, dark place, not too much extra moisture as well, important to keep an eye on. And these are general time frames. The interesting thing about fermentation, while we do have recipes, again, each fruit or vegetable is different. So it might have a different concentration of water or sugar or things within kind of a range. And you might have different tastes, for example, in terms of what you're looking for in your end products. So that's why there is a range in terms of time that it might take for these fermentations to occur. But as long as they're in the right condition, fermentations are probably less likely to spoil or go bad than some of your other food preservation processes. Again, that's not to say that they don't. So you do want to keep an eye out, and I have a resource that I will direct you to later at the end that has some common things to keep an eye out for when you are fermenting to see, is this the right kind of growth that I'm looking for, or maybe not what I'm looking for in my products. So I want to pause here and see if you have any questions about any of the different things that we want to look for when we're getting started thinking about the fermentation process. I'll give you a minute here. You can type into the chat. The next component that we're going to talk about is actually going through one of the tasty and exciting fermentation processes that I know a lot of folks are interested in doing in terms of fermenting cabbage and thinking about sauerkraut. So we'll talk a little bit more about that here. But I did want to pause and see if there are any questions that have come up so far, or maybe questions that you had written in that I haven't quite answered yet. And after this, I will direct you to some of our resources, but I will just mention now that a lot of the resources and the one that I'm gonna, the recipe that I'm gonna share with you here can be found in just about any state extension. But I know the SDSU has some great resources. Montana also has some resources. And we also have a trusty So Easy to Preserve book. I've got that here too. Another great recipe. The National Center for Food Preservation, also in connection with the So Easy to Preserve, has some fermentation recipes that you can check out too. So not seeing anything, I'm going to move on and we're going to talk a little bit about fermenting cabbage. So what are the things, so we've talked about some of the different steps that we need to consider. One of those was the environment. And so that environment that we're thinking about is also, what container are we going to actually do this fermentation in? Not all containers are created equal when it comes to preservation, just like canning, but we have a little bit more variety in what we can use. So when we're thinking about different containers, acceptable fermentation containers might be those stone crocks. I have a couple examples of images of what those look like. A lot of times you find they can be very large because when we are thinking about fermenting, especially cabbage, it's often done in larger quantities. And so those larger crocks are really great for this. And we'll talk a little bit about why it's often done in larger quantities in a minute. But you can also use enamel-lined pans, potentially. You want to make sure that they don't have any chips in it, just like you would want to avoid that in canning jars. You want to check to make sure there are no chips or nicks, because that's where some of those unhelpful bacteria and things can live. And so making sure, again, that those containers are cleaned and chip-free is really important. You can also use large glass bowls or jars or food-grade plastic containers. Not all plastic containers will work, so you really want to make sure that they're food grade. And another kind of disclaimer, we will talk about this weight component. Again, we want to keep that air out of the top of our fermentation, and one of those ways that we do that is by putting something on top, not just the lid, because that would leave some air, but by putting a weight on top. Often this can be a plastic bag with water in it, for example, salted water. That weight also matters in terms of what that is made out of. And a lot of times folks will consider using different plastic bags for that, but you want to make sure it's a food grade plastic bag, not necessarily like a garbage bag, but more along the lines of a bag that you might use for turkey, to cook turkey in the oven, or to line a crock pot, for example. So that food grade plastic is important to ensure that we're keeping the air out as well. So when we think about containers and we're thinking about sauerkraut, I have a couple different sizes of containers depending on the amount of cabbage that you're trying to ferment. And you can see here again, we have some 1 and 5 gallon, which is pretty large when you're thinking about things that you might have in your kitchen. But so I do know for myself, sometimes I use a smaller container, like a 2-quart jar here. And when I do that, though, I do that knowing that the smaller size, when you're fermenting something in a smaller container, it has more likelihood of going bad. So that's one of the reasons that we often go for those larger containers, is to reduce the likelihood that it might spoil. And so, again, I will say you can use these smaller containers. You won't find as many recipes that use the smaller containers, and that's why, because it's just a higher likelihood that they might spoil. When we're thinking about the weight that goes on top, that is also part of the equipment. Again, you want to make sure that that would entirely cover the top of your fermenting vegetable, and you're fermenting cabbage in this example. And there are some ways that you can do that that might come along with your jar or crock, but also, again, that food grade plastic bag with some salt water in it is a really great way if you don't have any additional equipment. And there are some airlock systems that you can also buy. A lot of them are for smaller jars that you can use to allow out any air, any bubbles that might have formed in the fermentation process, again, to keep it that anaerobic environment. So there are a lot of those on the market as well. The other thing, as we talked about, we want that fresh fruit or vegetable. So we want some of that fresh cabbage, and we want salt in terms of thinking about that pickling or canning salt as well. So then when we're thinking about preparing our cabbage, what are we going to do? Well, we're going to make sure all our utensils and preparation items are cleaned, and this means washing them, being sure they're thoroughly rinsed before you use them. You also want to wash your cabbage and remove those outer layers, again, to make sure there's not extra dirt on them. You don't need to do anything special necessarily. You're not cooking your cabbage before this process, because the preservation is happening with that live cabbage that has some of those bacteria on it that are going to help with the fermentation process. And then you can shred, cut, slice, chop, whatever your preferred end product might look like for your cabbage. That doesn't necessarily matter. You do want it to be uniform though, so it's fermenting at the same rate. And you also want to weigh your cabbage, because as you saw on the previous slide, different amounts of cabbage need different sizes of container. They also need different amounts of salt to achieve that safe salt concentration. So our next step is to create a brine. As I mentioned, some things like pickles, pickled cucumbers, for example, you're actually adding in a wet brine. So that means you're adding in a mixture of salt and water. But the fun thing about cabbage is that it has a lot of water in it, and the salt, adding salt, you're actually able to pull out some of that water. And so the cabbage is creating its own brine once you add salt. So you're mixing the salt in based on your recipe and the weight of your cabbage. You're massaging that cabbage. So literally massaging with your fingers, squishing. A lot of times people use a wooden dowel to pound the cabbage. There's any variety of ways that you can really ensure that that salt is getting uniformly mixed into that cabbage, and so that it can pull out that water to create that perfect fermentation environment. A little bit of it is taking time, so you want to massage it, but also give it 5 or 10 minutes to be able to pull out that water. An example that is really, if you've never done this fermentation process before, maybe you've made eggplant where you've put salt on it. That's a really neat one. I think that you can see a lot of the water coming out of that eggplant if you put a little bit of salt on it and leave it for a little bit of time. The same thing should happen here. So as you're making this brine, again, just adding salt, you're going to see this water starting to come along with your cabbage. The cabbage will get a little less firm because some of that water is coming out, but you will also see liquid forming, and that's a good thing. That's what we want to have happen. Then you're going to pack this cabbage into a jar. Again, remember our goal is to try to get all of the air out, so those little bubbles. As you're starting packing the jar, those little bubbles are air bubbles, and we want to get them out. So when we're packing, we want to firmly pack down into a jar or your stone crock, for example, and that is hopefully, again, in layers, so that you can be sure that as much of that air is already removed from the process so the fermentation can start. So you're pounding it down in layers in a jar, adding more, pounding it down. And as you're doing that, you should also be seeing some of that liquid come up. You can pour in some of your liquid that you might have already got from massaging your cabbage as well. That can be used in this process. But again, it should be producing its own liquid. And the end goal is that once you get all of your cabbage in, you want about 1 inch or 2 of that water, that brine, that liquid, to be above the top line of where your cabbage is at in the jar. And then you also want about 4 to 5 inches of space between the cabbage and the top of the container if you're thinking about a large crock, for example. That space will obviously be a little bit smaller if you're using a smaller jar, but you do want to have a little bit of that head space that you would have in a canning process as well, but you want to make sure that that liquid is above the vegetable, because that is what's keeping that air out. And then you also want to add that weight on top of the cabbage. So once you've ensured that there's that amount of liquid on top, you want to add your weight on top, whether that's the bag of additional liquid or some sort of other airlock system that might be keeping the air out. So then you let the fermentation happen. No need to cook, no need to necessarily watch it. The frequency that you'll watch your fermentation is you want to check it at least once a day as it is fermenting, because you're looking for some different things to be happening in that fermentation, and you want to make sure that maybe some of the undesirable things are not happening. So you want to keep an eye on that brine level, make sure that that liquid is above the vegetables, because if it goes below, you can always add more of that water and salt with the same salt concentration as you had in the initial brine. You can add more water in to make sure that that cabbage is covered. You check it daily to make sure you're not seeing any additional growths happening. If you are, a lot of times if it's a kind of a white scum, that's often something that you can scrape off, but you want to get it before it gets into the vegetables themselves, because that can cause loss of quality and potentially spoilage as well. But that's also why we check it every day to make sure it hasn't had time to penetrate maybe some of those vegetables. You also want to, if you're using a cloth covering along with a weight, you also want to rinse and replace that, or replace that each day, because anytime you're introducing additional things, you don't necessarily want to stir your sauerkraut, for example, because anytime you're introducing additional things, you might be introducing additional bacteria, for example, or things that we don't want to grow, increasing that potential for spoilage. So we want to, again, keep that environment as clean as possible, remove anything that looks unwanted. And then I will talk a little bit more about if you're not sure what you're seeing growing, this is where it gets a little bit tricky, but you're also checking to see that bubbling level. So I talked about those bubbles when you're packing the jar that are probably more along the air variety. As fermentation is happening and ensuring that you did get all those air bubbles out, you should start to see some bubbles forming again in your fermentation, and that is the fermentation process. So that's a byproduct that's coming off. And you want to allow those to escape, but you see here this picture that this fermentation is on a plate. Sometimes fermentations get a little excited and start sending their extra liquid and bubbles out of the jar. So if you are new to this, or if you have particularly fresh cabbage, for example, you want to be sure to have something underneath to catch any of those extras that might come out. Again, totally normal. It doesn't mean that your fermentation is going bad. It's just some extra coming out as well. And then our last step here is, how do we store or eat this fermentation? So again, fermentation, you want to look at about what temperature have you kept it at, and about, then you can do a little bit of guesstimating about how long it would take to achieve that full fermentation of being able to let those bacteria, for example, eat all of the sugars that they might want to. And once they're done fermenting, the bubbles will stop, but you can taste it along the way. And let's say you don't like your sauerkraut to be so sour, you can stop the fermentation process by doing a number of these steps as well. So maybe you are allowing it to be a little less sour. If you do stop the fermentation process early, you want to think about how long the shelf life of that fermentation won't be as long as a full fermentation though. So when we're thinking about a fully fermented food, they can last for 3 months or even longer, and keep that same quality, keep that taste and vegetable texture, for example. If you put them in a refrigerator, a root cellar, they might even last a few months longer. You can keep them in that crock, for example, in that cool, dark, non-dry environment. That dry environment, not moisture is what we're looking for. But you could freeze your jar, always a good strategy when continuing that food preservation process, and that will slow the fermentation process down quite a bit to the point that it's not continuing to ferment. The other option that you can do is you can can it. So you can either hot or raw pack water bath can is what you would do with most fermentations. And again, use a recipe when you're doing that, but that will stop the fermentation process as well, and then extend even longer the life that you might have for that fermented product. And so when we're thinking about fermentation, again, the amount of time that it will last, say in the refrigerator or in your crock, depends on what the fermentation is. Because we have so many different types of fermented foods, I can't necessarily give you an exact shelf life. But so it's individual product dependent, but it's also dependent on that salt concentration, because that salt concentration influences basically how much acid is in there, and then how low that pH is to be able to keep it a safe environment from other things potentially growing. And so I'm going to pop this up, and then I see we have some questions, so I will try to answer those questions here. So in terms of thinking about recommended resources, I again wanted to mention the National Center for Home Food Preservation. They have some great recipes in terms of fermentation, as well as canning those fermented foods after. And the So Easy to Preserve book, made by the same folks, has done a lot of testing and to see what are those safe products. And then you can go to your neighborhood university extension to see what resources they have, or maybe look in neighboring states too if you're not finding the recipe that you're looking for. Or, you know, just write your local extension agent and say, hey, do you have a good recipe for canning sauerkraut or for fermenting pickles, perhaps? And then I also wanted to mention this resource. You can also find it in you can also find some of these things at the National Center for Home Food Preservation, but North Carolina has a great resource on pickles and problems with pickled products. Again, we talked about that there is a difference between pickles and fermentation, but a lot of the maybe things that can go wrong are similar. And so some of those things I will just throw out there, that when do we think a fermentation has gone bad? We want to think about, are we seeing something that is maybe a different color that's growing on our product? Thanks for posting that. I see that is up in the chat box as well, so you can click on that. If you're seeing something that is, say, pink and fuzzy growing, that is not your average scum. And so that would be a point when you would say maybe that fermentation is not something that you want to keep. Also, if your fermentation, particularly thinking about fruits and vegetables, starts to get mushy, that is again another sign that something has gone wrong in the fermentation process. And also if it smells bad. Again, bad is relative, but thinking about that we are looking for that kind of acidic smell, but not necessarily if it smells so bad that it smells maybe rancid or something, you don't want to eat that. That's not necessarily a good smell. And as with almost every food preservation, or generally anything that I might be cooking in my kitchen, if you're in doubt, you can always call your local extension to see if they have some ideas about what might be happening. But if you're in doubt, you want to throw it out, because food safety is not something we want to mess around with. And since we don't necessarily have a pH thermometer in our kitchen that we can test to make sure that it's uniform throughout, we don't want to take risks. So fermented foods can be really tasty, but you also want to do it in a safe way. So now I feel like I've shared so much information with you. I want to go back and check some of these questions here. I see instead of using a crock or a large container to save time, are there recipes that pack the cabbage into pint and quart-sized jars? Yes. Yes, so you can use smaller jars. There are only a couple of, I have one university recipe, and I can't remember which university it is right now, that does give a recipe for that smaller size. But again, it is more likely to potentially spoil. So actually my first time that I fermented cabbage in a jar, it went bad almost immediately. So don't be discouraged if that happens, because I know sometimes a smaller quantity, especially if you're just starting out, is a good way to test it out and see. But be sure to check for some of these signs that it might not be going the way that you're hoping. And there are different weights. If you look for an airlock weight, a lot of times you can look for fermentation weights. They're kind of, a lot of times, they look a little funny and like a science project, but they often have a component that will let some of that air that's building up inside out of the jar, but not let any air in. And so you want to look specifically for fermentation weights. And so it can be possible, it can be done, and there's different tools to help you if you want to go along that route. Again, you can use a similar strategy of like a bag of water on top to be that weight too. If you don't have 1 to 2 inches of brine above the vegetable, can you mix up some brine separately? Yes. So if you're not getting enough liquid from that dry brine, that process where we didn't actually add any water, and the vegetable was hopefully creating enough, Again, you want to make sure you've got that fresh vegetable because hopefully it will produce enough water. But if you're not getting enough water, or if you're a few weeks in and your water level is getting lower, you can add back in more brine, but you want to make sure that it has that same water to salt concentration as you had before, because just as you're introducing anything new into that process that's already happening, it could have some potential to introduce, again, some of those things that we don't want to grow too. We've got another question. I've seen some jars after storage, the top of sauerkraut will turn dark on top. Yes, so is that because there's not enough brine? So sometimes that is because there's not enough brine. Sometimes it can be due to maybe the salt concentration moving around in the jar. Again, kind of higher salt concentrations in different parts can cause the color to change. So color change is not necessarily a sign that it's gone bad. You want to look a little bit deeper to see. But that's why I also, when I'm doing fermentations, anytime I see something that looks a little bit different, I want to check is this something that could be safe and normal, because there are a lot of growths, again, that are okay in a fermentation or things that we're trying to promote, but some of them are not. And so you just want to make sure, double check, when in doubt, throw it out. Let's see, did we get, I think that did I miss any questions, Abby? Did you see any that I missed, or Megan?
Brianna, someone is having difficulty typing it, so I'm gonna ask her question for. Jessica's wondering, for sourdough, should your container, let me make sure should your container not have any air?
Yeah.
And any tips on maintaining your starter long-term?
Yeah, so sourdough is one of those, is a different kind of fermentation. That's a yeast fermentation as well. And sourdough, you actually do have air able to come in, and you usually have some sort of cover over the top of your sourdough starter, so that additional things maybe don't fall into your sourdough starter. A lot of times I have mine out on my counter, or if I know that it's going to be a little while before I can make something with my sourdough starter, I'll put it in the refrigerator. Again, that slows down that fermentation process. But a sourdough starter is really, you're keeping that fermentation going. And to keep our sourdough starter happy, a lot of times we're adding flour to it. And so that flour has that sugar in it, and that's what is being broken down for the fermentation process, the bubbling, and that you don't necessarily have that same weight or the elimination of air really from that process. It kind of forms its own layer of being able to keep out the air. So again, there's so many variations in terms of what types of fermentations are happening. But with sourdough, it actually is creating its own anaerobic environment within that starter. So you don't have to worry as much about, keeping that weight on to keep the air out. That's a really good question. Keeping your sourdough starter happy, just make sure it's fed regularly with adding that water and flour. But also know that sometimes it can get overly excited. Again, if you have really fresh flour, for example, sometimes that fermentation can get a little bubbly and send that sourdough out. So have a plate underneath if you are new to sourdough starters as well. And look up lots of recipes for what to do with that extra sourdough starter. My favorite is making crackers right now. So yeah, there's lots of different things that you can do with it. But again, you're right, that's another type of fermentation. Really tasty, gives some good taste. But again, maybe the more that the less you feed your sourdough starter, know that it will get more sour as well. Because again, there's more of that acid that has built up in there too. I know I'm kind of over on time, so you can feel free to write any additional questions, and I'm happy to send some responses back as well. But I think Abby has some closing questions too.
Yes. Yep. So again, like she said, if you have any additional questions we didn't get to, please do reach out to, I'm going to put Megan and Hope's email in this chat box here, and you can definitely shoot them an email and they'll get you connected with Brianna for that as well. But we'll get going so we're not too over time with these last polling questions here. Let me get them up just to see how we've improved maybe our understanding. So of course, going back to the first one, let's see if it'll relaunch here. Just give me a second. There we go. So your knowledge on now fermenting. I'll give you a little bit more time to get those answers in. Okay. So we definitely got more confident, and that's exactly what we want to see. So perfect. There we go. Your ability to follow safe practices for fermenting now. Give you a few more seconds to get this response in. Okay, I'm gonna end this poll. Oh, we got a few more trickling in, so I'll give it a few more seconds here. Okay. So we again got more confident in this one as well. Okay, final poll. Knowing where to go for safe, research-tested recipes for preserving food, such as fermenting. Give you a few more seconds here. Okay. Won this poll, and we can definitely see that this one also improved, which is exactly what we want to see. Okay, well, that concludes the end of our program. We're so happy that you all decided to join us today. And so our next session will actually be on July 28th. And during that session, we will be covering jams and jellies. So look forward to that and tune into that. But thank you again, Brianna, for sharing with us a little bit about fermenting. And we hope you all have a great rest of your day.
Thanks all.